The Nebraska wind howled across the empty homestead, carrying with it the scent of coming snow. It was a sharp, biting gale that rattled the loose boards of the porch and stripped the last dead leaves from the cottonwoods near the creek. Samuel stood on the threshold of the house he had built with his own hands 6 years ago, watching the dust settle on the long road leading back to town. The riders were gone now. The men in the black coats, the ones with the paper that bore the bank's seal and the sheriff's signature, had vanished over the ridge, leaving behind only the silence of impending ruin. They had given him until sundown to vacate the premises. The foreclosure was final. The land, the house, the barn, it all belonged to the ledger now. But Samuel was not a man who moved according to the schedules of bankers, and he was certainly not a man who would drag his son out onto the open prairie in the teeth of a blizzard with nothing but the clothes on their backs. He turned his gaze downward to the boy sitting on the edge of the porch steps. Toby, small for 8 years old and wrapped in a coat that had once belonged to his mother, was shivering, though Samuel knew it wasn't entirely from the cold. The boy was watching him, his eyes wide and dark, waiting for the signal that would tell him whether they were living or dying that night. Samuel adjusted the brim of his hat, his face hardening into a mask of calm competence. He could not afford to look afraid. Fear was a luxury for men with options, and Samuel had none left, except one. He stepped off the porch, his boots crunching heavily on the frozen earth, and walked past the boy, resting a heavy hand on Toby's shoulder for a brief second. It was a promise without words. He walked toward the overgrown patch of briars behind the ruined stable, a place the bank agents had not bothered to inspect. Beneath the tangle of dead weeds lay the old stone well, dry as a bone and forgotten by everyone but him. "Toby," Samuel said, his voice low and steady against the wind, "get the small sack, the one with the dried apples and the matches. Don't run, just walk." The boy nodded, scrambling up to obey, trusting the command because he had no other anchor in this world. Samuel looked at the sky. The clouds were bruising purple and black in the north, a heavy curtain being drawn across the afternoon sun. They had 2 hours, perhaps 3, before the first flakes fell. If they were still visible when the snow started, they would freeze. If they were seen by the sheriff's men returning to check on the eviction, they would be arrested. The solution lay 20 feet down in the earth. It was madness, perhaps, to think a man and a boy could live in a hole in the ground, but the wind whispered that the alternative was a frozen death on the roadside. Samuel moved to the barn, bypassing the main doors which had been padlocked by the agents, and pried loose a loose siding board he had prepared days ago. He slipped inside the dark, hay-scented space to retrieve what he had hidden: a coil of heavy hemp rope, a lantern, a canvas tarp, and the toolbox that contained his life's trade. The preparations had begun weeks ago, in the quiet hours of the night when the hopelessness of the farm's finances became a mathematical certainty. Samuel had known the harvest would not cover the interest rates, which seemed to climb higher every time he visited the town. He had seen the way the town merchants looked at him, the pity mixed with dismissal. He had quietly stopped repairing the fences on the perimeter, letting the world think he was giving up, while secretly he had been hoarding. He had stashed the best timber from the woodpile under the floorboards of the stable. He had saved the last of the kerosene oil in sealed jars buried in the root cellar. He was not leaving. He was simply going deeper. The bank claimed the surface, the wind claimed the air, but the earth beneath his feet was still something he could shape. He dragged the supplies out to the edge of the briar patch, the physical exertion warming his blood. Toby returned, clutching the burlap sack to his chest, his breath puffing in small white clouds. "Are we leaving, Pa?" Toby asked, his voice trembling slightly. He looked toward the road, expecting the wagon, but the wagon was gone, sold 3 weeks ago to buy the flour and ammunition that now sat in a pile by the well. Samuel knelt, bringing his face level with his son's. He brushed a stray lock of hair from the boy's forehead, his rough fingers gentle. "No, son, we aren't running. We're going to ground. like the badger. You remember the badger?" Toby nodded slowly. "We're going to build a castle where the wind can't find us. But you have to be brave. You have to be quiet. Can you do that?" Toby swallowed hard, then nodded again, the fear in his eyes replaced by a spark of resolve. He was his father's son. Samuel stood up, coiled the rope over his shoulder, and kicked the dead briars away from the well's mouth. The dark opening yawned up at them, smelling of ancient stone and deep, cold earth. It was time to descend. Samuel worked with a methodical, rhythmic urgency. There was no panic in his movements, only the efficient economy of a man who knew that every wasted second was a leak in their survival. He secured the heavy hemp rope to the base of the massive oak tree that grew twisted and gnarled 10 yards from the well. He tested the knot, throwing his full weight against it, boots sliding in the dirt until he was satisfied it would hold the weight of a falling world. The well was wide, nearly 6 feet across, lined with field stones that had been set by men dead 50 years. It had gone dry a decade ago, the water table dropping away, leaving behind a vertical shaft of cool, damp air. Samuel lowered the toolbox first, watching it vanish into the gloom until it hit the bottom with a dull thud that echoed up the shaft. Next went the bundles of wood, the shorter planks he had cut to size in secret. "You're next, Toby," Samuel said, tying a bowline knot around the boy's waist. He checked the loop, ensuring it was snug but not cutting. "Wrap your legs around the rope. Keep your hands high. I've got you." He lowered the boy slowly, hand over hand, his forearms burning with the strain. He watched Toby's small face look up, pale and trusting, until the shadows swallowed him. "Feet flat when you land," Samuel called down, his voice booming strangely in the acoustics of the stone cylinder. "Stay against the wall." When the rope went slack, he exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He hauled the line up and began to lower the rest, the canvas, the bedding, the small barrel of water, the rifle. When finally Samuel lowered himself, the change in atmosphere was immediate. As he descended past the rim, the howling wind was cut off as if by a knife. The air became still, heavy, and smelled of wet rock and clay. It was warmer down here, protected from the biting wind chill, but it was a damp, creeping cold that would settle in the bones if not managed. He reached the bottom, his boots landing on the layer of dry, sandy silt that floored the well. It was dark, the only light coming from the gray circle of sky 20 feet above. Toby was pressed against the curved wall, holding the lantern. Samuel struck a match on his thumbnail, the flare hissing into life, and lit the wick. The golden glow pushed back the shadows, revealing the moss-slicked stones and the terrifying claustrophobia of their new reality. They were standing at the bottom of a stone throat, trapped by gravity and debt. "Is this home?" Toby whispered, looking at the dirt floor. Samuel looked around, assessing. The air was stale but breathable. The walls were solid. "Not yet," Samuel said, unhooking the rope. "But it will be. First, we get off the dirt." He grabbed 2 of the thickest planks he had dropped down. "Pass me the spade." They couldn't sleep on the silt. It would suck the heat right out of them. Samuel began to dig shallow trenches on opposite sides of the well floor to seat the sleeper beams. He worked fast, the spade ringing against small stones. He leveled the beams, checking them by eye, then began laying the floorboards across them. It was rough carpentry, done by lantern light in a confined space, but as the wooden platform came together, lifting them 3 inches off the cold earth, the space transformed. It was no longer just a hole. It was a structure, a foundation. The sky above began to turn a bruised gray, signaling the imminent arrival of the snow. Samuel knew the most dangerous part of the construction was next. They needed a roof, but not just for shelter. They needed to disappear. If the sheriff returned and saw a hole, he might look down. If he saw solid ground, he would keep walking. Samuel had planned this carefully. He had saved the heavy, weathered timber from the old wagon bed, wood that was already gray and stained with years of exposure. He had to climb back up to the top using the rope, his boots scrambling for purchase in the crevices of the stone lining. Once at the surface, the wind hit him again, violent and screaming. The first granules of ice were stinging his face. He dragged the heavy wagon timbers across the opening of the well. He didn't seal it completely. That would be a tomb. He laid the beams across the stone lip, spacing them carefully. Then he used the smaller planks to create a hatch mechanism, a section that could be pushed up from below but would sit flush when closed. The real trick was the camouflage. He took the canvas tarp, which he had smeared with glue and rolled in dirt and dead grass days before, and draped it over the timbers. It wasn't perfect, but in a blizzard, visibility would be near zero. Snow would cover it within an hour, blending the slight mound into the uneven terrain of the briar patch. He left a gap near the oak tree's roots, wedging a hollowed-out branch into the soil to serve as a breathing tube, angling it so the snow wouldn't clog the opening. The darkness inside the well became absolute as he pulled the last of the covering into place. He dropped back down the rope, sliding into the pitch black, counting the seconds until his boots hit the wooden floor he had built. "Pa?" Toby's voice was small in the dark. Samuel fumbled for the matchbox again, the scratch and flare illuminating the boy's face. "I'm here," Samuel said, turning up the lantern flame just a fraction to save oil. "We're closed in. Let the wind howl all it wants. It can't touch us now." He looked up. The ceiling was a patchwork of wood and canvas, terrifyingly close, but it held. The storm was raging just feet above their heads, but down here it was silent as a grave. Now that they were sealed in, the immediate threat of freezing changed forms. The temperature in the well was constant, roughly 50 degrees, which felt warm compared to the blizzard, but was deadly for sleeping without heat. However, fire was a dangerous guest in a space this small. It consumed the same air they needed to breathe. Samuel had anticipated this. He moved to the side of the well where the stones were irregular and pulled out a small iron pot he had salvaged, along with a length of tin pipe taken from an old stove. "We have to build the lungs of the house," Samuel told Toby, handing him a tool. "Hold this steady." He began to work on the wall where the roots of the great oak tree had disturbed the stones near the top. He wasn't just building a fire. He was engineering a draft. He positioned the pot on a flat stone, fitting the pipe sections together to run up the side of the wall, aiming for the gap he had left near the tree roots. It was a precarious setup. If the smoke didn't draw upward, they would choke. If the pipe got too hot, it could singe the canvas roof. Samuel shaved slivers of dry pine into the pot. "Watch the flame, Toby. It tells you the truth about the air." He struck a match. The flame flared orange, dancing erratically. Samuel held his breath. The smoke curled, hesitant at first, pooling in the bottom of the pot. Then, as the heat rose, it found the draft of the pipe. A thin gray stream was sucked upward, disappearing into the conduit and out into the storm above. It worked. The draw was strong. Samuel added a slightly larger piece of wood, watching the fire stabilize. The light from the small fire flickered against the damp stones, casting long, dancing shadows that made the well seem deeper than it was. Samuel sat back against the curved wall, exhaustion finally hitting him like a physical blow. His hands were raw, his knuckles bleeding where he had scraped them against the rock. He looked at Toby. The boy was staring at the fire, mesmerized. The terrifying vertical drop was gone, replaced by a strange circular room with a wooden floor and a tiny hearth. They were buried alive, yet they were safe. Samuel reached into the food sack and pulled out a strip of dried beef, breaking it in half. "Supper," he said, handing the larger piece to his son. "Chew it slow, make it last." Outside, the world was turning white, erasing the road, the house, and the footprints they had left. But down here, in the belly of the earth, a faint warmth began to radiate from the iron pot, pushing back the chill. Life inside the stone cylinder shrank to the basics of biology and physics, a daily negotiation between the finite resources they had lowered into the dark and the biological demands of two bodies. The first week taught Samuel that the greatest enemy was not the cold, nor the bank agents, but the rigid arithmetic of digestion and waste. They had established a kitchen corner and a latrine corner, separated by only 4 feet of floor space, a psychological boundary maintained by strict discipline. The sanitation bucket, a heavy galvanized pail with a tight-fitting wooden lid Samuel had fashioned with a rubber gasket cut from an old boot, was the most dangerous object in the well. "Lid stays on," Samuel instructed Toby, his voice serious as he demonstrated the seal. "If we smell it, we get sick. If we get sick down here, we don't climb back up." They established a rhythm for the unmentionable necessity. The bucket could only be opened when the fire was burning hot enough to draw the air swiftly up the pipe, carrying the scent away with the smoke. It was a humiliating intimacy, but Samuel treated it with the clinical detachment of a soldier, refusing to let shame erode their morale. Water was the next dictator of their routine. The small barrel they had lowered contained 20 gallons, enough for a month if they were careful, less if they were reckless. Samuel instituted a rationing protocol that was severe and non-negotiable. He used a tin ladle to measure out the water. 2 ladles for Toby in the morning, 2 at night. 3 for himself because he was doing the heavy labor of maintaining the shaft. Washing was a luxury they could not afford. They cleaned their faces with a damp rag, reusing the same corner of cloth day after day until the fabric stiffened with grime. The lack of hygiene began to itch, a physical crawling sensation under their layers of wool and cotton. But Samuel reminded himself that dirt was an insulator, a second skin that kept the heat in. The food stocks were arranged on a shelf he had wedged into a crevice in the stonework. A sack of flour, a jar of lard, the dried beef, and a precious bag of coffee beans he chewed one by one to stave off hunger headaches. Every meal was a math problem. If they ate the dried apples today, they wouldn't have the sugar for the deep freeze of January. Samuel watched Toby eat, counting every chew, measuring the boy's caloric intake against the hollows beginning to form beneath his cheekbones. The boy never complained, though Samuel often caught him staring at the water barrel with a longing that broke his heart. "It's a bank account, Toby," Samuel said softly, tapping the wood of the barrel. "We don't spend what we can't earn back." The perception of time dissolved in the semi-darkness, leaving them adrift in a sea of hours that had no sunrise or sunset. To keep their minds from fracturing under the weight of the monotony, Samuel created a calendar on the smoothest stone of the southern wall. He used a sharpened nail to scratch a tally mark for every sleep cycle, though sleep was a generous term for the fitful, vigilant dozing they managed on the hard wooden platform. The darkness was absolute when the lantern was out to save oil, a blackness so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing against the eyes. In those long, blind hours, the well became a mental echo chamber. Samuel could hear the blood rushing in his own ears, the scratch of a mouse moving somewhere in the stonework above, and the terrifying, muffled thuds of the world continuing without them. To combat the silence, Samuel began the lessons. He refused to let the boy turn feral in the dark. "What is 7 times 6? Samuel would ask in the pitch black, his voice echoing off the damp walls. Toby, curled into a ball against his father's side for warmth, would murmur the answer. They recited geography, listing the capitals of states Toby had never seen and likely never would. They mentally dismantled and rebuilt the plow, the wagon, and the barn, Samuel forcing the boy to visualize every bolt and beam. It was an exercise in memory and logic, a way to keep the neural pathways firing when there was no visual stimulation. But the most important ritual was the listening game. Samuel would quiet the boy, and they would strain their ears toward the hatch 20 feet above. They learned to read the muffled vibrations of the surface. A low, continuous moaning meant the wind was from the north. A rhythmic thumping meant a loose branch was hitting the oak tree. Once they heard the heavy, crunching tread of horses, slow, deliberate steps that paused near the briar patch. Samuel had clamped a hand over Toby's mouth instantly, extinguishing the lantern with a pinch of his fingers. They sat in the suffocating dark, hearts hammering against their ribs, as the muffled voices of men drifted down, indistinct, arguing, then fading. The riders had moved on, unaware that 2 human lives were suspended in the stone throat beneath their horses' hooves. That night, Samuel didn't sleep at all, gripping the handle of the shovel, waiting for a hatch opening that never came. The psychological toll was mounting. The walls seemed to lean in closer every day, the circle of their existence tightening like a noose. By the time the calendar wall bore 40 scratches, the winter had settled into a brutal, grinding freeze that tested the limits of their engineering. The crisis arrived not with a bang, but with a silent, creeping lethargy. It began on a Tuesday, or what Samuel calculated was a Tuesday. The wind above had been screaming for 2 days, a blizzard of historic violence that piled snow in drifts 10 feet deep. Down in the well, the temperature had dropped, forcing Samuel to feed the fire more aggressively. He had burned the last of the good oak and was now feeding the stove with the resin-heavy pine scraps. The smoke had always drawn well, pulled up by the heat differential, but slowly the air in the shaft began to change. It grew heavy, tasting of copper and soot. Toby complained of a headache and curled up, refusing to eat his ration. Samuel felt it too, a dull throb behind the eyes and a heaviness in his limbs that made lifting the ladle feel like hoisting a boulder. He looked at the lantern flame. It was burning low and blue, struggling for oxygen. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his lethargy. The ventilation tube. The snow must have drifted over the opening near the oak tree roots, sealing them in. The fire was consuming the oxygen, and the carbon monoxide was filling the well like water filling a cup. They were drowning in air. "Toby," Samuel croaked, shaking the boy. Toby groaned, his eyes rolling back, his movements sluggish. "Wake up! Sit up!" Samuel slapped the boy's cheeks, harder than he wanted to, until Toby cried out. "Keep breathing deep. I have to go up." Samuel stood, swaying on his feet. The climb to the surface was 20 feet of vertical struggle, and he was weakened by weeks of half rations and bad air. He tied the rope around his waist, his fingers fumbling with the knot, numb and clumsy. He looked up at the hatch. It was sealed tight by the weight of the snow on top of the canvas. He began the climb. Every pull was a battle. His muscles burned, screaming for oxygen that wasn't there. He braced his boots against the slick stones, slipping, scraping his knees, fighting gravity and the growing darkness in his vision. He reached the top, his head swimming, and pushed against the wooden hatch. It didn't budge. The snow had packed it into a sheet of concrete. He was trapped. He braced his back against the opposite wall of the well and pushed upward with his legs, gritting his teeth, a guttural roar tearing from his throat. He pushed until spots danced in his eyes, until he thought his spine would snap. With a cracking sound, the ice seal broke. He shoved the trap door up, and a cascade of snow poured down onto his face, freezing and shocking. He scrambled up through the hole, gasping, his lungs dragging in the violent, freezing gale of the surface. He crawled through the snow to the vent pipe, digging frantically with raw hands until he cleared the ice plug blocking the airway. He collapsed there for a moment, the wind howling over him, before remembering Toby. He had to go back down. He had to close the hatch. He had to survive. The recovery was slow. The fresh air that flooded down the shaft after Samuel cleared the vent was sharp and painful in their lungs, but it was life. They spent the next 2 days in a haze of exhaustion, huddled together under every scrap of blanket and canvas they owned, letting their bodies metabolize the trauma. But as the tally marks on the wall grew into the 60s and 70s, a subtle shift began to occur in the earth itself. The biting chill that radiated from the stone walls began to soften. The silence of the deep winter, which had been crisp and brittle, was replaced by a new sound, the drip, drip, drip of water. The snowpack above was melting. It wasn't spring yet, but the back of the winter was broken. This brought a new terror, dampness. The walls of the well glistened with moisture. The floorboards became slick. The bedding felt perpetually clammy. Their food was critically low. The flour was gone. The lard jar was scraped clean. They were down to the last strip of dried beef and a handful of coffee beans. Samuel looked at Toby, whose face was gaunt, the skin pale and translucent like parchment. The boy had stopped asking about the surface. He had accepted the well as his entire universe. This terrified Samuel more than the hunger. "Listen," Samuel whispered one evening, holding a finger to his lips. "Do you hear that?" Above them, the wind had lost its shriek, replaced by the soft, rhythmic drumming of rain. Rain meant warmth. Rain meant the ground was softening. "The world is washing its face, Toby. It's getting ready for us." Samuel began the preparations for departure. It was a gamble. If they emerged too early, the roads would be impassable mud, and they would starve in the open. If they stayed too long, the spring runoff might flood the well and drown them. He checked the rifle, cleaning the mechanism with the last drop of oil. He packed the remaining items, the tools, the lantern, the coil of rope, back into the burlap sacks. He shaved his face with a dull knife, scraping away the gray beard that had grown over the months. He wanted to look like a man when he surfaced, not a beast. He made Toby practice walking around the small perimeter of the well floor to strengthen his legs, which had grown weak from confinement. "We are going to walk a long way," Samuel told him. "We aren't stopping at the house. The house is a ghost. We're going west, to the railhead." Toby nodded, trusting the plan because the plan was all there was. The waiting was the hardest part, listening to the rain turn the world to mud, wondering if the sheriff was still watching, or if the bank had forgotten the man they tried to erase. On the morning of the exit, Samuel woke Toby before the sun would have hit the shaft, if the sun could reach them. He didn't light the fire. There was nothing left to burn. He tied the rope around Toby's waist again, the knot familiar and secure. "Up you go," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't look down. Look at the sky." He hoisted the boy up, his strength returning with the adrenaline of the moment. He watched Toby push the hatch open. A shaft of blinding, brilliant white light stabbed down into the well, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It was so bright it hurt. Toby scrambled out, vanishing into the glare. Samuel followed, hauling himself up the rope for the last time, his boots finding the footholds he had memorized in the dark. He rolled out of the hole and onto the wet, matting grass of the briar patch. The air smelled of wet earth, ozone, and rotting leaves, the perfume of life. He lay on his back for a moment, blinking against the assault of the gray, overcast sky, which looked impossibly vast after months of seeing only stone walls. He sat up. The homestead was still there. The house stood silent and peeling, a dead thing on the hill. The barn door was still padlocked, but the snow was gone, replaced by patches of green pushing through the brown. Toby was standing near the oak tree, his face turned toward the sun that was trying to break through the clouds, his eyes squinted shut, a smile stretching across his face. They didn't look back at the well. They didn't look back at the house. Samuel shouldered the pack, took his son's hand, and turned toward the horizon. They were thin, they were ragged, and they owned nothing but the tools on their backs and the air in their lungs. But they had beaten the winter. They had beaten the bank. They had vanished from the world and returned to it on their own terms. As they walked toward the road, the first true bird of spring called out from the cottonwoods, a sharp, piercing trill that sounded like victory. Samuel squeezed Toby's hand. "Walk tall, son," he said, the wind at their backs pushing them forward. "We made it through the night." And they walked on, leaving the empty well to hold their secrets in the dark.